right. Well, we are gone noon, so welcome everyone to NERI San Francisco's Lunch and Learn webinar. We're here today and are excited to share some information and some perspectives on climate-related disclosure, both from a state standards and frameworks perspective, as well as corporate investor relations perspective, and also from an investor's perspective. So we're excited to have you all here. Thank you to all of our NERI San Francisco members, to our guests. Also a big thank you to Broadridge, who is our corporate sponsor. And of course, thank you to our panelists. I'm joined today by Neil Stewart, Andrew McCabe, and Christina Gunnell, and I'll let each one of them introduce yourselves.
Hi, everybody. It's really great to join NERI San Francisco for this event. My name is Neil Stewart. I'm Director of Corporate Outreach for the Value Reporting Foundation. The VRF was created last year out of the combination of SASB, the Sustainability Accounting Standards Board, and the IIRC, the Integrated Reporting Council. So, we're part of the alphabet soup, but we're trying to simplify the alphabet soup. I know many NERI San Francisco members, especially from my time as editor of IR Magazine. And for many years, I'd come out to Palo Alto and do the West Coast think tank there. Got to know many of you there, and also at NERI Silicon Valley events and other NERI events. From there, I went to Citibank for a period, and then I wound up at SASB and full time in the ESG field now.
Thanks, Neil. Angie.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. So I'm Angie McCabe. I head up investor relations at Premier, which is a healthcare company. I joined the company in July of 2020 in the midst of the pandemic. I actually moved from California. I like to say I'm a native Californian, but I moved to Charlotte, North Carolina, where my company is based. Most of my investor relations background has been with healthcare companies, primarily in the managed care space. So if you're familiar with the old WellPoint Health Networks, which is now Anthem, previously was at Health Net, which is now with Centene, and then WellCare Health Plans, which was also acquired by Centene. So a lot of acquisitions having gone on in healthcare, and happy to be here in North Carolina, where we're actually getting rain today.
And I am Christina Gunnell. I am on the responsible investing team at Nuveen, and I lead engagement with our portfolio companies on ESG issues. May have met with some of you, and I have a particular focus on climate and the energy transition. I also work on analyzing ESG shareholder proposals, and then work internally with our analysts and portfolio managers, integrating ESG and sustainability into the investment process and into portfolio construction.
Wonderful. Well, it's very exciting to be here with you today. A very timely topic, with the SEC having a proposal out to make some of this voluntary disclosure mandatory. If you haven't commented and have something that you'd like to share, please go ahead. They recently extended the comment period through June 17th. So that's an option. And we know, to Neil's point about alphabet soup, there's a lot of different standards and frameworks out there. And to a certain extent, this might help make things easier for corporates, that there is more of a standardized approach and a required disclosure, but obviously there's a lot more to that. So we'll try to address a few of those aspects today. We'll start off with each of our panelists, taking 10 minutes or so to go over their perspective and share some thoughts. So we'll start with Neil. Go ahead.
Thanks, Malin. So we're in the midst of a pretty amazing shift in corporate reporting and ESG reporting, climate reporting more specifically. We're going from qualitative to quantitative, from stories to numbers to metrics, much more to metrics. It still includes a lot of narrative elements, but more towards metrics. And we're going from voluntary to mandatory. What this means is ESG data, ESG reporting is coming up to a level of financial reporting in terms of rigor, in terms of its use by the investment community, and in terms of the value placed on it by management and boards as well. We're hearing more and more about investor grade ESG data. I also think of it as director grade ESG data. It's being used in capital raising. It's been used in borrowing. It's been used in executive remuneration, in M&A due diligence. It's really come up to the level of the board. And this demands the involvement of investor relations in terms of communicating it to investors, using it as the basis for engagement with investors, and also feeding it back to management. So what I'm going to talk about is some of this move towards mandatory reporting, which involves standardization. And this is where I'm deeply involved. The Value Reporting Foundation, which houses the SASB standards, is consolidating into the IFRS Foundation. And the IFRS Foundation has launched the International Sustainability Standards Board. And that's what I'm going to focus on today, and also put that in the context of the SEC's climate proposal. So just to start with, how are investors looking at climate disclosure? I think it's pretty clear that investors globally have really coalesced around a mix of cross-industry climate risk disclosure, TCFD, and industry-based disclosure, very much around the SASB approach. And you can see on this slide a sample of some of the calls for TCFD and SASB aligned disclosure from big investors like BlackRock, from investment institutes, from pension funds, from government like UK government, or from sovereign wealth funds like Norges Bank. So this this approach has been really embedded into investment processes right across asset classes and across from specialist socially responsible investors, but very much in the mainstream, mutual funds and pension funds and so on. At the same time, these SASB and TCFD are being very, very widely used by businesses. So these around 2,600 organizations supporting TCFD recommendations. We've now reached over 1,850 reporters using SASB standards worldwide, over 50% of them outside the US. 3/4 of the S&P 500 now use the SASB standards, and around 2,500 businesses using the integrated reporting framework, which the VRF also maintains. So what we have seen is that investors really find this cross-industry combined with the industry-based approach a mix of qualitative and quantitative to really be the best solutions to meet their needs. So companies and investors have embraced these standards and frameworks. So in moving now towards standardization and mandatory reporting, the good news is that we are building on what's already in use in the market. We're not tearing up the playbook and writing a new one. We're building on the TCFD recommendations, the SASB standards. So this is how the ISSB, the International Sustainability Standards Board, is genuinely simplifying the disclosure landscape. Essentially, we're taking the five standards and frameworks that are already used in the financial markets and boiling them down into one. You can see here first of all, TCFD recommendations and the climate-related SASB topics and metrics have gone into creating a climate standard. This is out for comment now. Going forward, the remaining topics and metrics from the SASB standards, those not related to climate, be they human capital or say around cybersecurity or biodiversity and other issues that aren't necessarily climate related, are moving through ISSB due process and will finish up as industry-based disclosure requirements. And the integrated reporting framework becomes the responsibility of both the IASB and the ISSB, and provide the connecting framework between the two boards and between disclosures. I should make a point right up front about the IFRS Foundation. You being US companies might think, what has this got to do with us? We're not an IFRS country. Here in the US, we have US GAAP, not IFRS. The ISSB standards are being created to be GAAP agnostic in the sense that they can be used with US GAAP or IFRS. We expect them to be used worldwide through a combination of both regulatory adoption and investor pull. So again, investors are already using TCFD and SASB. This is now the next evolution of both of them. So let me give you a quick look at the climate and the general requirements exposure drafts that are out for comment. The ISSB is looking at climate first, but not climate only, even from day one. And that's because the general requirements do require disclosure of all material information on significant sustainability related risks and opportunities right from the start. I use the word significantly quite deliberately. These are not all risks and opportunities, significant risks and opportunities. That eases the challenge for preparers. You focus on what's material, not all that's out there. And this also relates to the industry-based approach that comes from the SASB standards. So the general requirements is essentially how to report, how to identify what's material, what matters to enterprise value. That's focusing on cash flows, cost of capital. But I do want to emphasize also that it includes not only the direct effect on the company, but also the consequences of an impact of the company on the environment and society and people. So that could include effects arising from up and down the value chain, supply chain issues, products and services issues. So it's not just internal impacts on finances, but also the external impacts that then impact back on the company. Importantly, the SASB standards are what's called in accounting speak priority materials right from the start. So when you look at the general requirements outside of climate, which I'll show you, the SASB standards are already built in. Outside of climate, companies should look to the SASB standards to identify what is significant in their industry or in their industries, and what are the metrics that can be used as common reporting language around those topics. Significantly, what the ISSB has done is taken the 4 pillars of the TCFD, governance, strategy, risk management, metrics, and targets, and extended them across all ESG issues. This is clearly the way businesses today are run. This is how boards and management look at their businesses, and this is how investors look at business in terms of these 4 content elements. And so whatever the topic is, this is how to address it. Turning to the climate standard now, really need to emphasize this incorporates TCFD and SASB requirements. It's been called TCFD enhanced. In essence, it's taken the voluntary high-level principles-based TCFD recommendations and rewritten them as an accounting standard that's ready to be put into rulemaking around the world, ready to be mandated and ready to be assured as needed. So verifiable, assurable. And then there's the SASB industry-based elements that have also been added. I want to make clear that this is not just a bolt-on, like an extra requirement or compliance burden, but rather a tool to ease the process for companies to help you identify, well, if we're going to look at climate risk, what are the particular issues or topics we should look at or metrics we should use? Is it about our greenhouse gas emissions, or actually is it about managing our supply chain, or is it about designing our products? What are the issues that we should be reporting on? And that's where the SASB standards are a tool, not an add-on or extra issue. Some of the things that were done to the SASB standards, the topics and metrics to move them into the climate standard, first of all, internationalize them. There were certain US biases in the metrics. We needed to make them globally applicable, and that's been done for the climate-related topics and metrics. Secondly, we added financed emissions to certain of the industries in the finance sector. Those were previously not in the SASB standards. Now they are part of the climate standard. So consistent with the TCFD, building on the SASB standards and combining together to make this really solid climate standard. A few links to helpful information published by the IFRS Foundation, including an overview, comparison between the climate draft and the TCFD recommendations, and so on. And happy to make this for NERI San Francisco to send these slides afterwards, and these are links to these resources. So just briefly, I want to explain a little bit about how the ISSB climate standard compares with the SEC, how it aligns with the SEC proposal. And the good news is they align very, very well. And this really contributes to establishing this global baseline so that we're all speaking the same language. Both the SEC and the ISSB have a very strong investor focus. That's the audience for this information, both built on the TCFD recommendations, and including the very specific governance, strategy, risk management, reporting requirements, and similar definitions of things like climate-related physical risks and transition risks. Very similar approach to greenhouse gas emissions disclosure, although that a little bit different in that the SEC is requiring scope 1 and 2 disclosure, scope 3 if material. The ISSB, every element in the ISSB requirements is subject to an entity level materiality assessment. Both the SEC and the ISSB reliant on the greenhouse gas protocol, although the ISSB requires the methodology, SEC refers to it, but does not quite require it. The SEC, of course, is mandating assurance. That is not something that the ISSB does as a standard setter. That's what we think of as a jurisdictional requirement that a securities regulator puts in place when establishing a rule. But the standard setter at the ISSB level, we don't require assurance. We just make sure that the standards are assurable. Materiality, very similar definitions in terms, it's all through the eyes of the investor. What matters to the investor, that's what's material. And importantly, it's what matters to the investor over the short, medium, and long term, not just the next quarter or last quarter, right? Under the SEC, certain disclosures are required regardless of materiality, including scope 1 and 2, as I mentioned, but also the risk management and governance disclosures. Again, ISSB, everything's subject to the entity level determination of materiality. A few more points. The ISSB is proposing that this be part of general purpose financial disclosure, but isn't specifying a particular location, so as not to conflict with local jurisdictional rules requirements. The SEC is prescribing 10K disclosure or 20F for non-US filers, quite and including both in as a footnote to the financial statements for certain disclosures, as well as more general disclosures in the rest of the 10K. I won't go into too much detail on the rest. One key point, though, very important, is that both are requiring climate disclosures at the same time as financial reporting, and that's a big challenge. No doubt companies are bracing themselves for how they're going to cope with that. So again, substantial alignment. We think that this can reduce the burden on issuers. The industry-based requirements of the ISSB are very much additive, complementary to the SEC proposal. And we suggest that the SEC could encourage the use of the ISSB climate standard for supplemental industry-based disclosures. Again, a tool to help reporters. What's next? We do call upon issuers to comment on the ISSB exposure drafts and indeed on the SEC and the Europe standards. Sorry about this slide is out of date. As Malin mentioned, the deadline for the SEC proposal has been extended out to June 17th for comment. So we really strongly encourage comment on all three. A few points that you might want to emphasize in your comments to the ISSB: that it's great to build on what's already in use in the market. This commitment to the industry-based approach will yield cost-effective processes for preparers, that is cost-effective preparation of reporting for companies, and useful information for investors, and also to commit to continuing that industry-based approach is really useful for both preparers and investors. So I invite everyone to comment and to emphasize these strong points, and at a technical level, if you can contribute the technical development of the standards, that'd be much appreciated as well. There's a survey that you can fill out, very quick and easy to fill out a survey, or even a short comment letter would be very useful. You don't need to respond to every question in the consultation. That goes with the SEC as well. Focus on what matters to you, what matters to your company. Even if it's at a high level, it really helps shape the standards. We have an opportunity now to get a really strong system of corporate reporting, and invite your input.
Great. Thank you so much, Neil, for that. And we'll have an opportunity for questions and answers at the back end here. But one quick question for you before we move on to Angie. Are these ready to be used by corporations already? Is there anything preventing anybody from starting to referring to them?
At the moment, they're at an exposure draft stage. We hope to have them ready by year end. So ready for voluntary use in the 2023 reporting year. Of course, it will take time for them to move into regulatory mandates in different parts of the world, but they should be ready to be used for the 2023 reporting year. In the meantime, for anyone who's standing on the sidelines waiting to see what happens, don't wait. There's no time to wait. Get started, and you can get started with the SASB standards and the TCFD recommendations, which essentially get you started on the ISSB, because that's what it's built on.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. And that is a great segue over to Angie to talk about the corporate perspective.
Right. Thanks, Malin. So just a little bit of background on who Premier is. We're a healthcare technology and performance improvement company, and we have two primary business segments. First, we have a supply chain services business where we've created a group, what's called a group purchasing organization, or GPO, which is basically an alliance of more than 4,000 hospitals, health systems, and other healthcare providers. And through that GPO, we've built a technology-enabled, what we call an end-to-end supply chain that helps our customers safely reduce costs and ensure resiliency. We also have contracts with more than 1,300 suppliers. So these suppliers could supply anything from medical supplies to what we call purchase services, which may be things that are non-healthcare related. And I think what's important to note here, and what we've in particularly learned at Premier is, especially over the past 2.5 years, is just how critically important a resilient supply chain is, particularly in healthcare. And then we have our performance services segment, which really leverages our healthcare data and technology platform to help our customers deliver improved outcomes and sustainable financial performance. And as we look ahead to value-based care, which the industry keeps talking about, we want to help them be successful under new payment models. So with regard to environmental sustainability at Premier, we really have it's a two-pronged approach. First, I'll hit the easy one first. We're really focused on ensuring that our business operations protect and improve the environment. So for example, we're headquartered in a LEED Gold certified building. We rely heavily on energy efficient light bulbs, and we leverage technology wherever possible to reduce paper waste. We don't own a transportation fleet. So while we are in the supply chain business, we don't actually, we're not in transportation. We just help our members, our customers procure the supplies they need. We've also recycled about 10 tons of electronic products over the past 5 years. And then second, we also help our customers, our hospitals, other providers choose responsible products and services that are safe and effective, yet minimize their environmental footprint. And I can't stress enough that because we are in healthcare, we do have to focus on the quality, safety, efficacy of products and services, as well as the environmental impact. So there's definitely there's definitely a balance there that we have to consider when you're in healthcare. So as we think about environmental and what our business actually does within, and I'm going to really focus on the supply chain services business because that's a larger piece of our business. but also I think it's where we would see the most environmental or climate impact. And it's not just what Premier's business operations itself are doing, but how are we helping our members and customers meet their targets, meet their requirements. So what we have done through our business, and our company's been in business for over 30 years. We've just been public since 2013. But over the years, it became known that environmental, sustainability, and climate-related issues and factors were really important to our customers. So we created a purchasing program that collects environmental impact data from all of our suppliers. So this would include chemicals of concern, recyclable or recycled packaging, and other responsible resources in their products. We also have a comprehensive vendor supplier selection process that we've implemented. So we have sourcing committees and clinical councils, and these would include pharmacy, lab, nursing, surgical, and cardiovascular experts and clinicians. And we factor this into how we select supplies. As I mentioned earlier, we also look at quality, safety, cost effectiveness, but we are also focusing on the environmental factor. We do partner with a third-party supply chain management provider, and this provider monitors a range of environmental issues within that supply chain cohort, and they look at things like identifying potential environmental hazards, chemical spills, that kind of thing. And then we also with them partner in incorporating risk scoring into our supply chain management processes. So through that process, we analyze trends, we can identify risky suppliers or parts, and we try to mitigate risks where we can. And I think something that we really need to focus on, at least from my perspective for this, is that what are we really trying to do here? I mean, we want to do good by the climate and the environment, et cetera, but from a business perspective, how are we actually mitigating risk? And I think, from an investor perspective, they look at that as well. So we are incorporating some risk scoring to analyze and mitigate risks where we can. And something that we're doing this year, one of our goals is to incorporate ESG assessment analytics into our processes and our systems so that we can further mitigate risks in the supply chain. I think, as we think about this from a business perspective, we're not just seeing investors focused on our environmental practices and disclosures. Increasingly, customers, both current and potential, are including questions in RFPs regarding our own environmental practices, but also how can we help them achieve their own targets. So from a business success perspective, it's becoming even more critical for the long-term success of Premier that we focus on this and implement best practices, I would say, as appropriate for the business as we think about the long term. In terms of, disclosures, I would say we're still in the early stages of what I would call our formal ESG program. We haven't yet established climate-related targets as of yet. This year, we are in the process of conducting our environmental assessment for Scope 1 and 2 emissions. We did publish our inaugural sustainability report last year alongside our proxy statement. And feedback from investors so far has been positive, but we recognize we have work to do, and they have communicated to that. They're beginning to push back on us. They would like us to establish some climate-related targets. They would like to see some more metrics in our reporting, but they understand it's a process. So we do have conversations with investors on ESG-related topics. We typically, and prior to even formalizing our process last year, we would engage with them 1 to 2 times per year, particularly with our largest stockholders through what we call stockholder engagement meetings. That would include not just a business and financial overview and strategy discussion, but we also incorporate an ESG discussion in that. So we do talk about, from an environmental perspective, what we're doing, both business operations and for our customers from an environmental perspective. we're talking about what we do from the S perspective, right? Social and the good things that we're doing there, and where we also have work to do. And then from the governance perspective, I think we talked about it earlier in Neil's presentation, just that metrics and how do we incorporate that into the business. So I will turn the call now over to Christina to give the investor perspective.
Yeah.
Thank you, Angie. Yeah, so just to reiterate, I'm on the responsible investing team at Nuveen, so helping integrate ESG and sustainability throughout our investment process. So as an investor, we aim to evaluate companies' sustainability and climate program through a risk lens. And just to back up and think about how investors look at risk more generally, we think about risk in two ways, or there's basically two types of risks. There's systematic risk and idiosyncratic risk. And systematic risk affects the entire economy, our entire portfolio, and can't be diversified away, while idiosyncratic risk is inherent to a specific company. And we relate this thinking about risk to climate and to environmental topics as well. So we take that lens when we're thinking about sustainability or ESG issues relating to a company. That idiosyncratic side of the risk profile is what would be more specific to you guys, because that's company specific risk. And that would be things like physical risk to company assets, and then also transition risk, like policy decisions that may have an impact on the business, and things that could be impacting financial performance, like a price on emissions or increased regulation, or a difference in demand for products, reputational damage, legal issues, things like that. So that's where we're really focused on evaluating company risk. And in order to do this, we really value disclosure, company disclosure specifically. And so far we've been really focused on TCFD and SASB disclosure from companies, and also often look at the disclosure on the CDP platform, which we find just to be a very helpful framework to go through and kind of do an apples to apples comparison of companies, because the questions are asked in a uniform manner. And we also like that companies are disclosing this information themselves rather than it being disclosed by some sort of third-party ESG rating agency that might not have as much insight into the company. And so sometimes we've seen problems with accuracy or perception from those parties. So we like to evaluate the company disclosures. And then our expectations for companies are that they are doing a materiality analysis to really figure out what is financially material to the company, and doing that from both looking at things like the SASB assessment, but also reaching out to various stakeholders to really get a holistic look at what is material, and then setting goals and targets around material issues that could have financial implications for the company, either in the near term or long term. And that includes, on the climate topic, disclosure around emissions, scope 1 and 2. We ask all companies to do scope 1 and 2 emissions disclosure and goal setting, and then scope 3 for companies where this is material, usually in more carbon heavy industries. And then just to explain a little bit more about our process, we do, when thinking about integration, we do that evaluation of risk, but we also are trying to really bake in this information into our investment process in all ways, not just from a risk lens. We see sustainability reporting as just another type of information that companies report out to shareholders. So looking at this, how will this affect our valuations of the company? What could be the impacts to different parts of the financial statements that might not be apparent quite yet? How will things like reducing operational emissions or pivots in business strategy related to the climate or energy transition, how will that affect the top line? How will that affect overhead? How will that affect CapEx? What are the actual quantitative numbers that go into some of these plans that the company is setting in place. And that's a lot of what we're looking at right now. We want to really understand the numbers behind ESG and sustainability. And then what are those business pivots going to look like? What is future demand for products or services going to look like? And really trying to think more holistically about that. And then I guess we also, when companies are thinking about their risk, we want them to think about sustainability from a broader stakeholder lens as well. I think some of the challenges that companies face is really controlling the narrative around their own company and what they're doing. I think that a lot of companies are doing a lot of good work and not necessarily expressing it that well. And sometimes perception is different from reality, especially in some of the more carbon heavy industries. So I think it's really important to have a really cohesive message that fits into various aspects of company reporting, programming, disclosure. So that could include policy related disclosure. For example, companies who are disclosing political contributions and lobbying should also be disclosing what those goals look like relating to climate and what their narrative is relating to climate policy and what they're pushing regulators to do, because sometimes there's a perception that some companies are working behind the scenes against climate regulation when they're not. So just instead of having that perception out there, and instead of having people speculate, just be very transparent and explicit about what the company is doing, and really controlling that narrative. I think that's helpful for companies and then for investors to really understand how there's alignment with what the company is saying in their sustainability report and with how the company is spending its money. And then, I think we also are focused on having alignment with the goals of the Paris Agreement. So disclosing how the company is doing that as well. And then I think the biggest thing we're focused on recently, and it's just becoming a bigger focus area for investors more generally, is accountability and company accountability. There's been such a push for transparency and additional disclosure over the last several years, and so many companies have now met that already, and they are reporting to TCFD, and they've built out very robust disclosures and robust goals. And now we're thinking about accountability towards those goals and what our company's doing to meet the challenges and to address the material issues that they've set out. And just wanted to highlight one company that has had some problems recently related to an ESG goal. It's not specifically a climate issue, but I'm sure a lot of you have heard of the fight Carl Icahn has had with McDonald's around using gestation crates for pigs. So outside of the specific issue that he's focused on, I would note that the perception from investors and from stakeholders more broadly is that McDonald's may have moved the goalposts on their ESG related goal. So lacking accountability relating to a goal that they set 10 years ago. And that is a concern for investors that, we've have expectations of the company based on the goals that the company set out, and now they may have changed those. So something to be cognizant of in the future, thinking about the spirit of goals that the company has set out rather than, maybe the very explicit language, because it seems like McDonald's looking for like a loophole in some of their language from their original goals. And that has, there's been a lot of reputational damage to the company because of this too. So just being explicit and transparent is something we're really looking for.
Great, that's really helpful, Christina. A quick question, follow up on that, since you're talking about accountability. Any thoughts on ESG factors in executive compensation and in compensation plans generally at companies?
Yeah, so we're asking companies to incorporate sustainability metrics into their compensation plans in a quantitative way. And those should be aligned with the sustainability goals that the company has set out, what it has defined as material, and what KPIs it has set. So, we expect alignment between what executives, what the incentives are for executives with these other material issues that come from their ESG topics as well.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Well, we will at this point open it up for Q&A. And I did have one question for Angie to kick us off here, but please, for our audience, use the Q&A function. There's a button at the bottom of your screen there where you can submit questions. Angie, I'm curious a little bit about the expectations. You mentioned customers as well as suppliers. Anything from regulators, and knowing you're in the healthcare industry, are you getting any pressure from regulators specifically?
Well, for those in healthcare, you may have heard that the White House and the Department of Health and Human Services have they issued a letter requesting healthcare companies to sign on to the climate pledge, which I think they want signatures or companies to sign on to by June 3rd. So there's definitely a push from the Biden administration towards climate related target setting and just doing your part for the environment. So there's pressure from that perspective. I think we're actually seeing, I wouldn't call it pressure, but we're seeing more interest, at least from the federal government side, on, I think, ESG overall. And really, we're trying to incorporate that as appropriate into the business. But I think the one thing that came to mind, Mullen, was the HHS pledge.
Well, it's interesting in putting that in context to what Christina was saying, the expectation from investors that if you put a goal out there, that you have a plan of how to approach it and how to reach it, and then also not moving the goalposts down the line.
Yeah, and I think, Mullen, on that, we want to be very thoughtful about, so we haven't put out any climate related goals or targets yet. We're still early in our process. We're doing the scope 1 and 2 emissions materiality assessment this year. I think when we look at our ESG program in totality, we're taking a phased in approach because there's so much work. While we do good things within the business, and I think this gets to Christina's point of your disclosures, like a lot of companies are doing good things. They're just not disclosing or communicating it appropriately. That's where we need to get to, is how do we disclose it? And also through that material or that environmental assessment, we have to know where we are before we can establish those goals, right? So once we know where we are, that baseline, we can go from there.
Yeah, very helpful. And here's a question for Neil. What happens to the SASB standards when these new guidelines come out?
So at the end of next month, we, the Value Reporting Foundation, become part of the IFRS Foundation. And the SASB standards will move under the ISSB during a transition phase. So the ISSB will actually be building ISSB standards while maintaining the existing SASB standards. The research projects, the proposed standards updates, the support that goes along with the SASB standards will continue during a transition period. As I mentioned before, the SASB standards can be used to meet the requirements, the general disclosure requirements, and certain topics and metrics are already built into the climate standard. Over time, through the due process of the ISSB, those SASB standards, the topics and metrics will move and become ISSB disclosure requirements. But for this transition period, they can continue to be used. So this name SASB standards will continue. Companies could continue to do a SASB standards disclosure or table index as companies do, at least for the next year before they start to move towards ISSB reporting.
That's helpful. So if you built up a nice history with SASB metrics, you don't need to sort of drop them. They can flow into this new framework. Absolutely.
They flow into the new framework. And importantly, I think even looking to the future, once companies have transitioned to the ISSB standards, that history of SASB reporting will still be intact and still usable. The topics and metrics will flow pretty fluidly through to the ISSB, even including the metric codes.
That's excellent. Thank you for clarifying. And then we have a question for Christina here around accountability and the fact that some companies have put goals out that were set years ago, and information, science, reality might have changed. So if a company finds themselves in a situation where their circumstances have changed and they really do need to revise or realign their goals, any advice on how to approach that?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think just being as transparent as possible and really explaining the reason why goals need to be reset and doing it in a transparent way so shareholders and other stakeholders don't feel like someone's trying to pull the wool over their eyes, that it's just, okay, this is what happened. This goal was not achievable. We thought it would be, and now it's not. And that could happen for a variety of reasons. We've seen companies have that happen because the company itself has changed in a major way. Maybe they've gone through some M&A activity, or maybe their portfolio of assets has significantly changed. And the goals that were set maybe 10 years ago are not realistic anymore. So a lot of times companies will reset their goals when a major corporate action or corporate event happens. But yeah, also if it's just becoming clear that either a goal needs to be extended, or it's not going to be hit, or it needs to be maybe toned down in scope, but that there's still something being achieved, that could be in the case of McDonald's, just being really clear and transparent, because that's where there's going to be, thinking back to that narrative, there's going to be pushback from the broader, economy or broader media reputational standpoint. So as long as everything's being really crystal clear and upfront, and trying to own the situation, I think that is the way to handle it to minimize blowback.
That's helpful. Transparency is key, it sounds like. Angie, a question for you. For companies that haven't yet really started with their environmental efforts, how do you recommend it getting started? And also, who should own these environmental initiatives? Any thoughts on where in the organization you position them?
Good question, because we faced this just a year and a half ago when we started down this road. So we engaged, actually got buy-in from the CFO, and honestly, some companies are still in that. It's still in that stage where there's not complete buy-in internally that this is important. Although I would say the landscape's changing now, especially with the SEC and their disclosure proposals. So our CFO owns it, and it just made sense, because through disclosures, there's some things that are going to have to go in the 10K. There's things that go in our proxy statement, and then filing a sustainability report. It made sense for our CFO to own it from the executive level. We also engaged, because we didn't really know where to start. We engaged a third-party vendor. I'll give kudos to Malin and her team. We engaged Third Economy, and we did do a robust RFP process. We wanted to align. We wanted to see what made most sense for our company, where we are, and our business when we went through that selection process. And then recognizing how much work there really is to do, from understanding your business processes, how much disclosure requirements there currently are versus what's coming down the pike, and then understanding that it is a process, a journey, what makes the most sense. And so we have implemented a phased-in approach. So we actually, the CFO owns it from an executive level. We established an ESG steering committee that is cross-functional from across the organization. And it's not a huge group, because you also don't want to get too many chefs in the kitchen. But we also have a core ESG working team, and I'm on that team. My director's on that team. And then we actually have our internal audit person on that team. We established oversight at the board level, and our nominating and governance, it's in the nominating and governance committee charter that they actually own it. Although the entire board has to review the sustainability report and sign off on it. And then the compensation committee also reviews anything related to governance and executive compensation. And the audit committee reviews the whole thing as well. So it's sort of a shared responsibility. And then we pull in subject matter experts as appropriate, depending on what the subject matter is in either the sustainability report or other disclosures. So we really have, I think we have a pretty streamlined process. Everyone knows what their roles and responsibilities are. I think because we're in healthcare and it's such a hot topic now, the folks that we do have working on this initiative, they're completely bought into it and they are committed to this. So they get it. And I think that's sort of half the battle.
Yeah. Thank you, Angie. You definitely have a great team assembled there. I'm curious, Christina, from your perspective, as you think about engaging with your portfolio companies and in particular their boards, where do you see sort of that oversight and responsibility for environment lie?
Yeah, so we do also look for explicit oversight of ESG related issues from either one or multiple board committees. And I think it depends on the company on where they situate that, but it should be explicit. And sometimes we've seen companies break up different aspects of sustainability amongst different committees so that they, maybe the audit committee is handling one part, the compensation committee handling another part. And that's fine. And I think there's different ways to do it as long as there is that oversight. But also to add to that other point that Angie made, and just in general around accountability, we do also look for those third-party assurances around both the disclosures and the goals that have been set for companies. I think that gives us additional peace of mind that these are all set in a robust way and really are doing the things that they are saying that they're doing.
Yeah, that's helpful.
And can I just add on to that something that came up to what Christina said about a third party is last year we didn't have our internal auditor on the core team. And we decided that it would be a good practice as we started you sort of want from an audit perspective, as you think about like your financial disclosures, you do want that, I call it the paper trail. You want to know the source of all the information, how things are calculated. If the audit committee is going to sign off on this, they want that source. And then we would work with our external independent auditors on this going forward.
Yeah. Yeah, and having it all report up sort of through your CFO and having that executive sponsorship in that function obviously puts you well sort of on the path to this more integrated reporting that Neil mentioned. And on that topic, Neil, any thoughts from what you've heard or seen as far as corporate response to the SEC proposal specifically? Curious if you've got some perspective there.
Well, and I maybe I need to preface this by saying it's my personal views and not those of VRF or ISSB, because as a standard setter, we're not weighing in to certainly, or not trying to influence the SEC rulemaking. The SEC will do what's right for the U.S. market, what's right for U.S. companies and U.S. investors. But I think we could all agree that the SEC went further than I think most people expected, as certain elements of the proposal are considered to be challenging from a company's perspective. For one thing, the 1% materiality threshold for the line item note on impacts of climate in the financial statements in the SX portion of the 10K, that 1% is seen by companies and by accountants as just being a really, really low threshold. And I think particularly onerous for small caps. If you think about it, for a small cap company, you could really easily get over that 1% mark for certain line items. I think smaller issuers are excluded from the scope 3 requirement, but I think issuers generally are finding it hard to get their heads around scope 3. It's looking up and down the value chain. This is a big challenge. There's estimations needed. There's judgment calls needed, and all that really bothers folks like internal auditors and lawyers, right? To start to get into that fuzzy area. So I think there's a lot of there's some fine tuning needed for the SEC climate proposal, but let's also acknowledge that was a long time coming. This is desperately needed by investors and by companies to give clear guidance. And I think what the SEC's main message is really a strong one and very important to consider. The SEC has been saying since the climate proposal came out, look, companies are already doing this. Investors are already using this information. All the SEC is doing is providing rules of the road, doing standardization. And I think, Christina, you made this point very strongly, is that, companies are already following TCFD. You're already building this into your investment processes. What's coming now is standardization and mandatory consistent reporting. So let's not get too much in a twist over this. This was coming down the road, and the SEC is putting much needed guidance around what's already best practice in the market.
Yeah. That's helpful, Neil. And Christine, I'm curious about your perspective on specifically those scope 3, those gnarly scope 3 emissions, because a company has to do quite a bit of work to even figure out what is material or not ahead of disclosing. So any thoughts there on how you view those?
I think the question of whether it's material or not is an easier question than how to calculate it, because I think it's clear which companies it's material for. Generally, companies with where scope 3 is more than 40% of their overall emissions, approximately, is what we would consider material. But how to calculate it, we support the GHG protocols calculation methodology, but understand that companies are really struggling through this issue right now, and we're encouraging companies to focus on it and figure out the methodology, but with the caveat that it's still kind of a little bit in flux compared to so much else. But that's definitely a material factor for a lot of companies. So we need to definitely still continue to focus on it. And I think one thing companies tend to bring up is double counting of scope 3 emissions and how that should be factored in, specifically double counting throughout the value chain of a product. So from an investor standpoint, when we're looking at an individual company, we don't necessarily care if emissions are being double counted. Someone who's trying to calculate the total emissions in the economy or in a country might care if emissions are being double counted, but as an investor, those emissions, even if they're double counted somewhere else, those scope 3 emissions are inherent to that company. And that is a representation of the transition risk of that company. Whether, it's being also counted down the line somewhere else, if there's some sort of additional regulatory measures on emissions, that's going to hit that company. So, the double counting issue isn't as relevant to us as investors as it is to some other stakeholders.
That's very helpful. Thank you. Well, we're coming up on time here. Maybe one quick last round around the table here. Any last thoughts or advice to our audience?
Maybe I could send a message to investor relations officers. This is a risky point in the road. We're going from voluntary to mandatory, and we risk ending up with box ticking compliance that's onerous for companies and pretty much useless for the users, for investors. We've got to keep the value of this disclosure. We've got to make sure that we focus on decision useful information, living up to the spirit of these new standards, not just the letter. So I encourage companies to keep your eye on meaningful communication with your stakeholders, especially investors.
Thank you, Neil. Andy, any last minute thoughts?
I just think, along the lines of what Neil said, we're really taking the approach of what's material to the business and as appropriate, because you can get mired in sort of that data paralysis. And it's a huge undertaking, especially when you're starting from scratch and you're thinking about everything that you want to disclose versus what you have to disclose. So I think my advice would be do the phased approach if you can get away with that, knowing that there may be timeline on the horizon where we have to start, start disclosing things. That would be my advice.
Thank you, Angie. Get started. How about you, Christina?
Get started.
Yeah, I definitely think that, we are in favor of this consolidation of reporting. So there's not so many different frameworks out there, and companies can be much more focused, because we do want to limit the reporting burden, and we acknowledge that that does create a burden on companies, and that's not, we don't want that to be so great or focused on things that are not material. So again, making sure that you're focused on materiality, and then also around the narrative of what the strategy is around climate and sustainability. That would be my parting words.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much. Thank you to our panelists. Thank you to our audience. Thank you to our sponsor, Broadridge. And if you haven't yet signed up for NERI National, the meeting is happening in Boston in early June, and I think you can still sign up. So hopefully we'll see you there. Thank you so much, everyone. Have a good day.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Bye-bye now.